close your eyes and let everything fall away. You are standing on top of a wall, high in the mountains of northern China, and the night air is cool against your skin. Stars fill the sky above you, and the wall stretches ahead into the darkness like a stone river frozen mid-flow. This is the Great Wall of China, and almost everything you think you know about it is probably wrong. Let us start with the most famous myth of all. You have probably heard that the Great Wall is visible from space, and it sounds like the kind of thing that should be true. A structure so enormous, so ambitious, that astronauts can spot it from orbit with their bare eyes. But they cannot. Multiple astronauts have confirmed this, and the reason is surprisingly simple. The wall is long, yes, but it is only about 5 meters wide, roughly the width of a 2-lane road. From space, trying to see the wall would be like trying to spot a single human hair from 2 miles away. The myth has been around for centuries, long before anyone actually went to space to check. Here is something else most people get wrong. They imagine the Great Wall as one enormous construction project, as if a single emperor woke up one morning and decided to build a wall across China. That is not what happened. The Great Wall is not one wall. It is dozens of walls built over more than 2,000 years by rival kingdoms that were often at war with each other. Some of those walls ran parallel. Some overlapped. Some were built specifically to keep out the neighbors who had built the previous wall. The earliest sections date back to the 7th century BC, when small feudal states in northern China began piling up earthen barriers against raiding parties from the steppe. Those first walls were not stone at all. They were rammed earth, made by pounding layers of dirt between wooden frames until the soil became as hard as brick. Some of those rammed earth sections still stand today, more than 2,000 years later, baked by sun and wind into something almost geological. But the man who turned the wall into a national obsession was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He came to power in 221 BC after conquering all 6 rival kingdoms, and he immediately ordered their separate border walls linked together into one continuous barrier across the north. Hundreds of thousands of workers were conscripted for the project, including soldiers, peasants, and convicted criminals. The conditions were brutal. Workers hauled earth and stone up mountain ridges by hand, and many of them never came home. Chinese historians would later write that bodies were buried within the wall itself, though modern archaeology has found little evidence of this. What is certain is that the human cost was enormous, and the wall became a symbol of imperial ambition built on ordinary suffering. The emperor himself was a man of extraordinary contradictions. He standardized weights, measures, currency, and even the width of cart axles across his empire. He built roads and canals that connected distant provinces for the first time, and yet he was consumed by a terror of dying. Qin Shi Huang spent years searching for an elixir of immortality. His court alchemists prepared potions they promised would grant eternal life. Many of those potions contained mercury, which the alchemists considered a substance of transformation and power. Modern historians believe the mercury slowly poisoned him. The emperor, who feared death above all else, was likely killed by his own desperate attempts to avoid it. He died in 210 BC while traveling far from the capital, and his closest advisors faced a problem. If word of the emperor's death spread before they could secure the succession, the empire might collapse into civil war. So they kept it secret. They continued the journey as if nothing had happened, issuing orders in the emperor's name from behind the curtains of his carriage. But it was summer, and the body began to decay. To mask the smell, they ordered carts of salted fish to travel directly ahead and behind the imperial carriage. For weeks, the procession moved through the countryside surrounded by the overpowering stench of preserved fish, and no one outside the inner circle knew the emperor was dead. Meanwhile, the wall he had commanded continued to grow, long after the man who ordered it had gone silent in his carriage. You lean against the stone parapet now, and the wind moves steadily across the ridge. The wall beneath your hands feels solid in a way that modern concrete rarely does, and there is a reason for that. During the Ming Dynasty, roughly the 1300s through the 1600s, builders developed a mortar recipe that was genuinely remarkable. They mixed lime with sticky rice, the same glutinous rice used in cooking, and created a paste that seeped into every crack and gap in the stonework. Laboratory tests conducted in recent years have shown that this sticky rice mortar is stronger than Portland cement, the standard building material of the modern world. The organic compounds in the rice created a denser, more compact microstructure that resisted cracking and weathering for centuries. The builders of the Ming Dynasty could not have explained the chemistry, but they understood through generations of trial and error that rice made their walls last. And last they did. The sections most tourists visit today. The dramatic stone staircases climbing steep mountain ridges near Beijing are almost entirely Ming Dynasty construction. They are roughly 500 to 700 years old, held together by sticky rice and the patience of workers who carried every ingredient up these mountains by hand. The total length of all wall sections ever built, when measured by China's State Administration of Cultural Heritage, comes to more than 21,000 kilometers. That is longer than the distance from New York to Perth, Australia, halfway around the planet. Of course, much of that length is now ruins or buried mounds of earth that you would walk past without recognizing as a wall at all. But the sheer ambition of it remains almost impossible to grasp, even standing here in the dark with the stones under your feet. This wall was not built by one empire with a grand vision. It was built by centuries of fear, ambition, stubbornness, and the labor of millions of ordinary people whose names were never written down. And in the chapters ahead, you will walk deeper along this wall and discover the lives that filled it. The soldiers who grew vegetables in tiny garrison gardens, the merchants who passed through its gates carrying tea and silk, the signal fires that could send a message 500 miles in a single day. But for now, the night is quiet, and the wall holds you up above the valley, like a bridge between the world you know and the world that built this place. Rest here for a moment. There is so much more to discover. Imagine being posted to the farthest edge of everything you have ever known, where the farmland ends and the grassland begins, and your only company is a handful of fellow soldiers and a wall. That was daily life for the garrison troops of the Great Wall, and it was not the heroic existence that imperial propaganda suggested. Most soldiers stationed along the wall were not elite warriors. They were ordinary conscripts, farmers pulled from their villages for years of mandatory service. They arrived carrying everything they owned, and what greeted them was a watchtower made of stone and packed earth, usually no larger than a modest apartment. A typical Ming Dynasty watchtower stood about 12 meters tall and housed a garrison of somewhere between 30 and 50 men. The ground floor was used for storage, the middle floors for sleeping and cooking, and the rooftop served as the observation platform. Space was tight, privacy was non-existent, and the wind at that altitude cut through clothing like it was not there at all. But the soldiers adapted, as soldiers always do, and one of the ways they adapted was surprisingly domestic. On the rooftops and in the small courtyards of garrison towers, soldiers planted gardens. They grew vegetables in shallow beds of soil carried up from the valleys below, coaxing scallions, garlic, and leafy greens out of the thin mountain air. It was partly practical, because supply deliveries were unreliable and the official rations were monotonous at best. But it was also something else. A small garden is a quiet protest against the bleakness of a military posting on the edge of nowhere. The basic garrison diet consisted mainly of millet porridge, sometimes supplemented with salted meat or dried vegetables sent from towns in the lowlands. When supplies were delayed, which happened often during winter or periods of conflict, the soldiers relied on whatever they had stored or grown themselves. Archaeological excavations at wall sites have uncovered grinding stones, cooking pots, and the remains of grain stores, the quiet evidence of men simply trying to feed themselves far from home. Letters from wall garrisons have survived as well, written on bamboo strips and wooden tablets, and many of them are heartbreakingly mundane. Soldiers wrote home asking for warmer clothing, for news of their families, for money to buy supplies that the military failed to provide. One famous collection of garrison letters, discovered near the northwestern frontier, includes a soldier complaining that his winter trousers had not arrived and asking his family to send them urgently. 2,000 years later, the request still feels familiar. You walk along the top of the wall now, passing another watchtower as the stars shift slowly overhead. If you had been standing here during an actual alert, you would have witnessed one of the most impressive communication systems of the ancient world. The Great Wall's beacon fire network could transmit a warning message across 500 miles in a single day, at a time when the fastest horse courier took many days to cover the same distance. The system worked like a relay. When lookouts at a frontier tower spotted an approaching enemy force, they lit a fire on the tower's rooftop platform. The next tower, usually positioned within clear line of sight a few miles away, saw the smoke and lit its own fire, and the signal leapt from tower to tower across the mountains. During the day, smoke was the primary signal. At night, open flame was used instead, because smoke would be invisible against a dark sky. And not just any fuel would do. The garrisons along the wall preferred to burn wolf dung for their signal fires, and they had a very specific reason. Smoke from burning wood tends to scatter quickly in strong wind, breaking apart before the neighboring tower can read it clearly. But smoke from wolf dung holds its shape. It rises in a thick, cohesive column that remains visible even in the harsh winds that sweep across the northern mountains. Soldiers collected and dried wolf dung in dedicated storage areas within the watchtowers, treating it as essential military equipment rather than waste. The system was not limited to a simple yes or no alarm either. The number of fires lit simultaneously conveyed specific information about the size of the approaching threat. One fire meant a small raiding party. 2 fires indicated a larger force. 3 or more fires signaled a serious invasion requiring immediate reinforcements. Commanders stationed deeper within the interior could look toward the frontier and read the severity of the situation at a glance, then dispatch troops accordingly. It was elegant, reliable, and far faster than any alternative available at the time. The beacon system also created an unexpected problem that tells you something about human nature. According to Chinese historical tradition, King Yu of Zhou, who ruled centuries before Qin Shi Huang, once lit the beacon fires as a joke to amuse a concubine who rarely smiled. The lords of neighboring regions rushed to the capital with their armies, only to find there was no emergency, and the concubine finally laughed at the spectacle of confused soldiers. When a real invasion came later, the king lit the beacons again, and no one responded. Historians debate whether this story is literally true, but it has survived for over 2,000 years as a cautionary tale about the cost of false alarms. Beyond the beacon system, watchtower life followed a rhythm dictated by duty rosters and the slow rotation of the seasons. Soldiers took turns on watch, scanning the northern horizon for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders from the steppe. A dust cloud moving fast and staying low usually meant cavalry. A wider, slower cloud suggested livestock being driven southward, which might mean a migration rather than a raid. Learning to read the landscape was a survival skill. The difference between correctly interpreting a dust cloud and misreading it could determine whether reinforcements arrived in time. Off-duty hours were filled with equipment maintenance, cooking, and the particular boredom that comes from guarding a border where nothing happens for weeks at a time. Gambling was common, despite being officially forbidden, and archaeological finds at garrison sites include dice and game boards scratched into stone surfaces. Some soldiers carved graffiti into the walls of their towers, leaving behind names, dates, and occasionally small drawings that have outlasted every other record of their existence. These markings are not grand inscriptions. They are the idle scratchings of bored young men far from home, and they are among the most human artifacts the wall has preserved. The garrison system also required a vast logistics network that stretched hundreds of miles behind the wall itself. Grain, weapons, clothing, and construction materials had to be transported from production centers deep in the interior to remote mountain outposts that were often accessible only by narrow paths. Donkeys and mules carried most of the load, picking their way along trails that clung to the edges of steep ridges. The supply chain was the unglamorous backbone of the entire wall system, and when it failed, garrisons weakened and sections of the wall fell into disrepair. Keeping the wall functioning was never a single act of construction. It was a continuous, exhausting commitment of resources, labor, and political will that had to be renewed by every generation. When a dynasty was strong and centralized, the wall was maintained and its garrisons were well supplied. When a dynasty weakened, the frontier soldiers were often the first to be forgotten, left to fend for themselves in towers that slowly crumbled around them. You pause now beside one of those towers, resting your hand against the cold stone. Somewhere inside this structure, centuries ago, a soldier tended a small fire and waited for morning, watching the same stars you are watching now. He might have been thinking about his family, or his garden, or the trousers he asked them to send. The wall remembers none of this and all of this, holding the shape of every life that passed through it without recording a single name. Rest here for a moment, beside the tower. The next stretch of wall will take you to the gates where merchants gathered and where the real business of the frontier began. You continue walking along the wall, and the path begins to descend toward a wide valley where two ridges nearly touch. In the gap between them, the wall thickens and drops to ground level, and you can make out the outline of a massive gate complex built into the stonework. This is where the wall stopped being a barrier and started being a border crossing, because the Great Wall was never just a military structure. It was a customs checkpoint, a tax collection point, and the place where two very different economies met and did business with each other. The civilizations south of the wall were agrarian. They grew rice, wheat, and millet. They raised silkworms, and they produced tea in enormous quantities. The peoples north of the wall were pastoral nomads. They raised horses, sheep, cattle, and goats across the vast grasslands of the Mongolian steppe. Each side had something the other desperately needed, and the wall's gates were where the exchange happened. The basic equation was remarkably simple. Tea went north, and horses came south. The nomadic peoples of the steppe had developed a deep dependence on tea, not merely as a pleasant drink, but as a nutritional necessity. Their diet consisted heavily of meat and dairy, and tea provided essential vitamins and aided digestion in ways that no other available food or drink could match. For the Chinese empires, horses were equally critical. The steppe breeds were larger, faster, and hardier than anything raised in the agricultural south. Without a steady supply of northern horses, imperial armies could not field effective cavalry. And without cavalry, they could not defend the very wall that controlled the horse trade. It was a cycle of mutual dependence that no amount of political hostility could entirely break. The tea horse trade became so important that the government formalized it into an official exchange system with fixed rates. During certain periods, one good war horse could be traded for as much as 60 or 70 kilograms of compressed tea bricks. Tea bricks, incidentally, were not just a convenient packaging format. On the steppe, compressed tea functioned as a form of currency in its own right. You could buy a sheep with the right quantity of tea bricks, which made them simultaneously a beverage, a trade good, and money. The gate towns that grew up around the wall's major passes became thriving commercial hubs, far livelier than the lonely watchtowers on the ridges above. Markets clustered on both sides of the wall, and on busy trading days, the gates were crowded with camel trains, horse herds, and merchants haggling in multiple languages. Silk was another major export heading north and west. Chinese silk had been reaching Central Asia and even Rome for centuries along the network of routes collectively known as the Silk Road. Many of those routes passed directly through gates in the Great Wall, making the wall not an endpoint, but a way station on a trading network that stretched across the entire continent. The most famous of these gateways was the Jade Gate, or Human Pass, which stood at the western end of the wall in what is now Gansu province. Its name came from the jade that was carried through it from the mines of Central Asia, a stone the Chinese valued more highly than gold. Passing through the Jade Gate meant leaving the protection of the wall and entering the open desert and step beyond, a transition that poets and travelers wrote about for centuries. But trade through the wall was never entirely free. The gates were controlled, and the government taxed nearly everything that passed through them. Officials stationed at the gates inspected goods, collected duties, and maintained detailed records of what entered and what left the empire. These customs records have survived in some cases, written on wooden slips that were preserved by the dry desert climate near the western wall sections. They reveal a trade that went far beyond tea, silk, and horses. Furs, medicinal herbs, rhubarb, musk, and precious metals all moved through the gates in both directions. Where there are customs officials, of course, there are smugglers, and the Great Wall had plenty of both. Contraband trade flourished along the less guarded sections of the wall, particularly in remote areas where garrison strength was low and the terrain offered cover. Salt was a common smuggled good because the government maintained a monopoly on salt production and taxed it heavily. Enterprising merchants found ways to move untaxed salt through gaps in the wall around its endpoints, or simply by bribing the soldiers stationed at smaller gates. The authorities responded with harsher penalties, which mostly just raised the price smugglers could charge without actually stopping the trade. This pattern, strict regulation followed by creative evasion, repeated itself along the wall for centuries, a quiet contest between the state and the market that the market usually won. You step through the gate now, moving from the Chinese side to the northern side, and even in your imagination, the atmosphere shifts. The farmland gives way to open grassland, and the air smells different, drier and sharper, carrying the faint scent of wild thyme and livestock. The cultural exchange across this border was far deeper than most people realize. Food traditions crossed the wall in both directions. Noodle-making techniques may have traveled northward into Central Asia, while dairy fermentation practices came south. Musical instruments, clothing styles, and even words migrated back and forth across the frontier through centuries of contact between settled farmers and mobile herders. Intermarriage between Chinese frontier settlers and nomadic peoples was common, despite periodic government attempts to restrict it. Children of these mixed families grew up bilingual, comfortable on both sides of the wall, and often became the most effective interpreters and trade brokers on the frontier. The wall, in other words, was never the clean dividing line that emperors wanted it to be. It was more like a membrane, something that slowed and regulated the movement of people and goods without ever fully stopping it. Even during periods of open warfare between Chinese dynasties and northern confederations, some form of trade almost always continued, because neither side could afford to do without what the other produced. One of the more surprising aspects of the gate towns was their diversity. Merchants from dozens of different ethnic and linguistic groups gathered there. Uyghur traders, Tibetan horse dealers, Sogdian middlemen from Central Asia, and occasionally Persian or Arab merchants who had traveled the full length of the Silk Road all passed through. The gate towns needed translators, money changers, innkeepers, and cooks who could prepare food for travelers with very different dietary customs. Some of these towns grew into substantial cities that persisted for centuries, their economies entirely dependent on the flow of goods through the wall. When the political situation closed the gates, these towns withered. When trade resumed, they sprang back to life almost immediately. The wall created the border, and the border created the economy, and the economy made the wall worth maintaining even when its military purpose was debatable. You turn back now and pass through the gate again, returning to the Chinese side as the night deepens around you. The market stalls are empty in the darkness, but you can almost sense the residue of all that commerce, all those transactions conducted in a dozen languages over hundreds of years. The wall ahead climbs back up into the mountains, and the next chapter of its story is written into the stone itself, in the labor of the workers who carried every block to the top. But that story can wait for a few more minutes. For now, the gate town is quiet, and the wind carries nothing but silence. The wall climbs steeply now, and you climb with it, following a staircase of uneven stone steps that rise at an angle so sharp your legs begin to ache just imagining it. Someone carried these stones here. Every single one of them was moved into place by human hands. And understanding how that happened is one of the most remarkable parts of the wall's story. The construction techniques used on the Great Wall changed dramatically over its 2,000-year history, and each era left its own signature in the materials. The earliest walls, built during the Warring States period and the Qin dynasty, were almost entirely rammed earth. Workers set up parallel wooden frames, shoveled loose soil between them, and then pounded the earth with heavy wooden tampers until it compressed into a dense, rock-hard layer. Then they added another layer of soil on top and repeated the process, building the wall upward one compressed stratum at a time. You can still see the individual layers in surviving rammed earth sections, thin horizontal lines stacked like the pages of an enormous book laid on its side. In the western deserts, where stone and timber were scarce, builders improvised with whatever the landscape provided. Some sections were built using alternating layers of tamped earth and bundles of reeds or tamarisk branches, a technique that added tensile strength to the structure. It worked on roughly the same principle as modern rebar in concrete, flexible organic material reinforcing a rigid mineral one. These desert sections are among the oldest surviving parts of the wall, preserved by the extreme dryness of the Gobi region, where rain is rare enough to be newsworthy. The shift to brick and cut stone came much later, primarily during the Ming Dynasty, which ruled from 1368 to 1644. The Ming emperors poured extraordinary resources into rebuilding and extending the wall, and they wanted something more permanent than packed dirt. Brick kilns were established in towns near the wall, and the bricks were stamped with identifying marks that recorded which kiln produced them and sometimes which official supervised the work. This was not decorative. It was quality control. If a section of wall crumbled prematurely, the stamps allowed authorities to trace the faulty bricks back to the kiln that made them. The kiln operators could be punished, which provided a strong incentive to maintain high standards. Getting those bricks and stones to the construction site was an enormous logistical challenge, especially in the mountainous terrain near Beijing, where the wall follows the ridgelines. On gentler slopes, workers formed human chains, passing bricks and baskets of mortar from hand to hand up the hillside. On steeper sections, they loaded materials onto the backs of donkeys and goats, animals sure-footed enough to navigate narrow mountain paths that would defeat a wheeled cart. There are accounts of workers using simple rope and pulley systems to haul stone blocks up near vertical cliff faces, a method that was effective but painfully slow. One particularly creative solution involved ice. During winter, workers poured water on the mountain paths and waited for it to freeze into a smooth surface. They then slid heavy stone blocks uphill on the ice, using far less effort than would have been required on bare rock. The same technique was used to transport the massive stones for the Forbidden City in Beijing, so it was well established in Chinese engineering practice. The labor force itself was drawn from several sources, none of them voluntary. Military conscripts formed the largest group, soldiers who spent as much time building and repairing the wall as they did guarding it. Peasant corvée laborers were drafted from surrounding provinces, pulled away from their farms for months or even years of mandatory construction service. Convicted criminals were also sent to the wall, where hard labor served as both punishment and a source of free manpower for the state. The conditions for all three groups were harsh. Workers lived in temporary camps with minimal shelter, ate basic rations, and labored through extreme heat in summer and brutal cold in winter. Injury and illness were common, and medical care was rudimentary at best. The human cost of the wall became one of its defining themes in Chinese culture, a source of grief and resentment that echoed through centuries of poetry, song, and legend. The most famous of these legends is the story of Meng Jiangnu, and it is one of the best-known folk tales in all of China. According to the story, Meng Jiangnu was a young woman whose husband was conscripted to work on the wall shortly after their wedding. Months passed with no word from him, so she sewed warm clothing and set out on the long journey north to find him. When she finally reached the wall, she learned that her husband had died from exhaustion and been buried somewhere within the construction. Meng Jiangnu wept at the base of the wall for days, and her grief was so powerful that the wall itself cracked open, revealing the bones of her husband and countless other workers. The story has been told and retold for over 1,000 years, in opera, in ballads, in picture books, and in film. Its endurance reflects something real about how ordinary Chinese people understood the wall, not as a monument to imperial glory, but as a thing built on the backs and bodies of people like themselves. Whether bodies were literally buried inside the wall remains a matter of archaeological debate. Some human remains have been found near wall construction sites, but clear evidence of deliberate burial within the wall structure itself is scarce. What is not debatable is that many workers died during construction and were buried nearby in unmarked graves that have long since disappeared into the landscape. The wall beneath your feet carries that weight, whether or not the bones are literally inside it. You pause now on a section where the wall follows a ridgeline so narrow that the structure is barely wider than the walkway on top. The terrain here dictated everything about the wall's design, and the builders adapted their methods to match every type of landscape they encountered. On flat plains, the wall was built wide and tall, with broad foundations and enough room on top for 5 or 6 soldiers to walk abreast. In the mountains, it narrowed dramatically, sometimes to just a few feet wide, snaking along the spine of a ridge where there was simply no room for anything larger. At river crossings, the wall incorporated sluice gates that allowed water to flow through while still maintaining the defensive barrier above. In some locations, natural cliffs were considered sufficient and no wall was built at all, the landscape itself serving as the barrier. The builders understood that the wall did not need to be equally strong everywhere. It needed to be strong where the terrain was weak and could afford to be modest where nature had already done the work. This pragmatism extended to the watchtowers, which were spaced closer together in vulnerable lowland areas and farther apart on steep mountain sections where an attack was less likely. The entire system was a continuous negotiation between ambition and geography, between what the empire wanted and what the mountains would allow. Construction records from the Ming Dynasty suggest that a skilled work crew could complete roughly 1 to 2 meters of finished wall per day under favorable conditions. That pace sounds almost absurdly slow until you consider that each meter involved quarrying stone, transporting it uphill, mixing mortar, laying courses, and finishing the surface. At that rate, building even a single continuous kilometer of wall in difficult terrain could take a large crew more than a year. Multiply that by thousands of kilometers, and you begin to understand why the wall was never truly finished. Every dynasty that invested in the wall eventually reached the same conclusion, that maintaining and extending it consumed resources faster than any treasury could replenish them. And yet they kept building, because the alternative, an open frontier with no barrier at all, seemed even more expensive in the long run. The wind moves quietly along the ridge now, and the stones beneath you hold the memory of every hand that placed them here. Somewhere below the wall, the terrain falls away into a valley where the construction camps once stood, where workers slept on bare ground and rose before dawn to carry another load of bricks uphill. The wall does not record their names, but it records their work in every joint, every fitted stone, every careful layer of mortar mixed with sticky rice and patience. Rest your hands on the parapet and breathe the cool night air. Ahead, the wall continues its long march across the mountains, and its story is far from over. The wall stretches ahead of you along a moonlit ridge, and from up here you can see something that most photographs never capture. Off to the east, a second line of wall runs roughly parallel to the one you are standing on, separated by a valley maybe half a mile wide. These are walls built by different dynasties, centuries apart, each generation deciding that the previous wall was in the wrong place or not strong enough or simply too old to bother repairing. The history of the Great Wall is not a story of one long construction project. It is a story of building, abandoning, forgetting, and building again. After Qin Shi Huang linked the first walls together in the 3rd century BC, his dynasty collapsed in barely 15 years. The Han dynasty that followed him took a very different approach to the northern frontier. Rather than simply maintaining the Qin walls, the Han extended them dramatically westward, pushing the fortified border deep into Central Asia along the Silk Road corridor. The Han wall system eventually reached as far as the Jade Gate in modern Gansu province, more than 1,000 kilometers west of anything the Qin had built. This expansion was driven partly by military strategy and partly by trade, because controlling the western corridor meant controlling the flow of silk, jade, and horses along the most profitable trade route on Earth. But the Han also discovered what every subsequent dynasty would learn. A longer wall required more soldiers, more supplies, and more money to maintain. When the Han dynasty weakened and eventually fell in 220 AD, the wall system fragmented along with the empire. For the next several centuries, China splintered into competing kingdoms, and the walls became less a national border than a series of local fortifications maintained by whoever happened to control the territory. Some sections were actively maintained. Others were stripped for building materials or simply left to erode. The wall's fate was always a mirror of the dynasty behind it. Strong central government meant a strong wall. Weak government meant a crumbling one. Then came the moment that exposed the wall's fundamental limitation, and it arrived on horseback. In the early 13th century, Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes and turned his attention south toward China. The wall at that time was maintained by the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China, and on paper it should have presented a serious obstacle. It did not. The Mongol armies found gaps, bribed or intimidated local commanders into opening gates, and in some cases simply rode around the wall's western endpoint into undefended territory. The wall was designed to stop raiding parties, not a full-scale invasion led by one of the most effective military commanders in human history. By 1279, the Mongols under Kublai Khan had conquered all of China and established the Yuan dynasty. And here is where the story takes an ironic turn. The Mongol rulers had no use for the wall at all. The wall had been built to keep the northern nomads out, and now the northern nomads were running the country. Maintaining a border fortification against your own people made no strategic sense, so the Yuan dynasty let the wall decay for nearly a century. It was as if the wall simply ceased to exist as a functioning structure, reduced to a long line of crumbling earthwork and abandoned towers stretching across mountains that no one was guarding. The wall's resurrection came with the Ming dynasty, which drove the Mongols back to the steppe in 1368 and immediately recognized that the threat had not disappeared, only retreated. The Ming emperors launched the most ambitious wall-building campaign in history, and the structure they created is essentially the Great Wall that the world recognizes today. They replaced the old rammed earth with brick and cut stone. They standardized tower designs and spacing. They widened the walkway on top to allow rapid troop movement along the wall itself. The Ming Wall incorporated drainage systems to channel rainwater away from the structure, a practical detail that dramatically extended its lifespan. They also added crenellations, the notched parapets along the top that allowed defenders to shelter behind the wall while firing arrows or dropping stones on attackers below. The engineering was sophisticated, but the Ming builders also understood that the wall alone was not enough. They developed a defense-in-depth system with multiple lines of walls, forward observation posts beyond the main wall, and garrison towns positioned to provide rapid reinforcement. The most heavily fortified sections were concentrated around the passes leading to Beijing, because the Ming capital was dangerously close to the northern frontier. One of those passes, Juyong Pass, was fortified so heavily that it became essentially an enclosed valley with walls running along both ridgelines and a fortified road running through the center. An attacking army that entered the pass would find itself trapped in a stone corridor with defenders firing down from both sides, a kill zone designed with cold precision. But even the Ming Wall was not invulnerable, and the dynasty's end proved it in the most dramatic way possible. In 1644, a rebel army under Li Zicheng captured Beijing, and the last Ming emperor hanged himself in the imperial garden. A Ming general named Wu Sangui was stationed at Shanhai Pass, the critical eastern gateway where the wall meets the sea. Faced with the rebel army now controlling the capital, Wu Sangui made a decision that changed Chinese history. He opened the gate and invited the Manchu armies from the north to enter China and help him fight the rebels. The Manchus came through the wall, defeated the rebels, and then simply kept going. They conquered all of China and established the Qing dynasty, which would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The wall had not been breached by force. It had been opened from the inside by a man who decided the enemy beyond the wall was preferable to the enemy behind it. Like the Mongols before them, the Manchu Qing dynasty had little interest in maintaining the wall. Their empire eventually expanded far beyond it, incorporating Mongolia and other northern territories, which made the wall an internal feature rather than a border. For the second time in its history, the wall was effectively retired, left to the weather and to the local villagers who found more practical uses for its materials. The pattern is striking when you step back and look at it. The wall was built by dynasties that feared the north, abandoned by dynasties that came from the north, and rebuilt by dynasties that feared the north again. Its rises and falls track the political anxieties of whoever controlled the Chinese heartland, a stone seismograph recording centuries of imperial insecurity. You stand on the wall now and feel the weight of all those cycles beneath your feet, construction and collapse and construction again. The stones are quiet, but they hold the memory of every dynasty that decided this wall was worth building and every dynasty that decided it was not. The night is deeper now, and the stars have shifted overhead. The wall ahead is darker, less maintained, and the next stretch of its story moves into the long centuries of neglect that nearly erased it from the landscape entirely. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, let the silence settle around you and rest. The wall beneath your feet changes here. The paving stones are cracked and uneven, and in places they have disappeared entirely, replaced by hard-packed earth and tufts of dry grass growing through the gaps. You are walking along a section of wall that no tourist bus has ever visited, far from the restored staircases and souvenir stalls near Beijing. Out here, the wall is slowly returning to the landscape that produced it, and the story of how that happened is quieter than the story of how it was built, but no less interesting. When the Qing dynasty absorbed Mongolia into its empire in the 17th and 18th centuries, the wall lost its strategic purpose almost entirely. The frontier it once guarded was now deep inside imperial territory, and the government saw no reason to spend money maintaining a fortification that defended against a threat that no longer existed. The garrisons were withdrawn. The beacon towers went dark. The supply lines dried up, and the wall entered a long silence that would last for centuries. What happened next was not dramatic. It was the slow, patient work of ordinary people solving ordinary problems. Villagers living near the wall looked at its bricks and saw building material, already cut, already fired, already conveniently stacked in long, accessible rows. They took the bricks home and used them to build houses, pig pens, boundary walls for their fields, and floors for their courting yards. It was not vandalism in any deliberate sense. It was practicality. The wall was abandoned. The bricks were right there, and a farmer needed a new wall around his vegetable garden. Over generations, entire sections of the wall were dismantled brick by brick, absorbed into the villages that surrounded it. In some communities, you can still find Great Wall bricks built into farmhouse walls and garden paths, the imperial stamps still faintly visible on their surfaces. The same bricks that were once stamped for quality control by Ming Dynasty officials now hold up a shelf in someone's kitchen. The 20th century brought new kinds of damage. During the political upheavals of the early republic, warlords quarried wall stone for road construction and railway beds. Sections of wall were dynamited to make way for highways, and the rubble was graded flat and paved over, the wall literally becoming the road that replaced it. During the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s, the wall received no special protection. The political atmosphere of that era viewed ancient monuments with suspicion as relics of a feudal past that the revolution was supposed to leave behind. Communities were encouraged to repurpose wall materials for productive construction, and many did, building homes, irrigation channels, and even dam foundations from dismantled wall sections. There is a well-known story, though difficult to verify precisely, that Mao Zedong himself once suggested that the wall's bricks would be better used in new construction than left standing as a monument to imperial oppression. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the sentiment was widely shared, and the wall continued to shrink. By the time preservation efforts began in earnest in the 1980s, the damage was extensive. A comprehensive survey conducted by China's State Administration of Cultural Heritage found that less than 10% of the Ming Dynasty wall remained in good condition. Roughly 30% had deteriorated significantly, and large stretches had vanished completely, reduced to low mounds of earth that blended into the surrounding terrain. In the western deserts, ancient rammed earth sections were being eroded by sandstorms at a measurable rate, losing centimeters of material with each passing decade. Researchers estimated that some of these sections could disappear within a generation if nothing was done. The shift in attitude toward preservation came gradually, driven partly by growing national pride and partly by the realization that the wall had significant economic potential as a tourist destination. The Chinese government designated the wall as a protected national monument and began imposing penalties for removing bricks or damaging the structure. Restoration projects were launched at the most iconic sections, particularly Badaling, Mutianyu, and Jinshanling near Beijing, which became the photogenic faces of the wall that the world would come to recognize. But restoration itself raised difficult questions that preservationists continue to debate. Some restored sections were rebuilt so thoroughly that they looked almost new, with fresh bricks, smooth mortar, and uniform surfaces that bore little resemblance to anything historically authentic. Critics described these restorations as theme park versions of the wall, more useful for tourist selfies than for historical understanding. Others argued that without aggressive restoration, the wall would simply continue to crumble until there was nothing left to argue about. The tension between preservation and restoration is not unique to the Great Wall, but the wall's sheer scale makes the problem almost impossibly large. You cannot restore 21,000 kilometers of anything, so choices must be made about which sections to save, which to stabilize, and which to let go. Tourism has brought its own complications. The most popular sections near Beijing receive millions of visitors each year, and the foot traffic itself wears down the very stones that the restoration was meant to protect. Visitors carve their names into bricks, a modern echo of the garrison soldiers who scratched graffiti into their watchtower walls, though with considerably less historical justification. Vendors have set up permanent stalls along the most visited stretches, selling souvenirs, bottled water, and T-shirts that say, "I climbed the Great Wall," turning sections of the ancient frontier into an open-air shopping mall. Meanwhile, the remote and unrestored sections tell a very different story. Hundreds of kilometers from the nearest tourist facility, the wild wall crumbles in silence. Trees grow through the watchtowers, their roots slowly prying apart the stonework. Bushes colonize the walkway, and the parapets have collapsed into piles of rubble that look more like a hiking trail than a fortification. Some adventurous hikers seek out these wild sections specifically, preferring the raw, unmediated experience of walking a ruin that no one has repaired or sanitized. They describe a different kind of beauty out here, the beauty of something enormous in the process of returning to the earth that made it. Small conservation organizations have sprung up around some of these remote sections, staffed by local volunteers who clear vegetation, stabilize loose stonework, and document the wall's condition year by year. Their work is unglamorous and largely invisible, a quiet effort to slow the wall's decline without pretending that it can be reversed entirely. The wall, after all, was never meant to last forever. It was built to serve a purpose, and when that purpose ended, its materials naturally returned to circulation. You walk slowly now along the crumbling parapet, stepping carefully where the stones have shifted underfoot. The darkness around you feels wider here, less contained, as if the wall itself is loosening its grip on the landscape and letting the mountains reclaim their original shape. A watchtower stands ahead, its roof long gone, its interior open to the stars. Grass grows across the floor where soldiers once slept and cooked and waited. The tower does not look sad exactly. It looks peaceful, like something that has finally been allowed to stop working. You step inside and lean against the wall, feeling the cool stone through your clothing. The night is very quiet here, and the next chapter is the last one. It will not ask you to learn anything more. It will only ask you to rest. You are still inside the watchtower, leaning against the cool stone, and the night has reached its deepest and most quiet hour. The sky above the open roof is filled with stars. more than you can count, scattered across the darkness like something spilled that no one has cleaned up. The wall extends in both directions from this tower, disappearing into the mountains to the east and the west, and you have walked a long way tonight. You have learned things about this wall that most people never discover, and now those facts are settling into your mind the way sediment settles in still water, gently, without effort. The mortar mixed with sticky rice, the signal fires fueled by wolf dung, the emperor preserved in secret behind carts of salted fish. They are all part of this wall now, folded into the stone along with everything else. You step outside the tower and back onto the walkway, and the air is noticeably cooler than it was when you began. The wind has dropped to almost nothing, just a faint movement against your skin, carrying the dry scent of mountain grass and old stone. The wall follows the ridgeline ahead in a long, gentle curve, and the moonlight catches the top of the parapet in a pale silver line that traces the contour of the mountains. You walk slowly now, and there is no hurry at all. Somewhere far below you, in the valley to the south, a village is sleeping. Its lights have been out for hours, and the people there live in houses whose foundations may contain a few bricks carried down from this very wall. The bricks do not mind. They have been walls before, and they are walls again, just lower and warmer ones. 2,000 years of construction and repair and neglect and rebuilding have left the Great Wall in a state that no single word quite describes. It is not a ruin because too much of it still stands. It is not a monument because no one is maintaining most of it. It is something in between, a structure that has outlived every purpose it was ever given and continues to exist simply because stone is patient and mountains are slow. The parapet beside you is worn smooth by centuries of weather, and your hand moves along it easily as you walk. In a few places, you can feel shallow grooves cut into the stone, the remnants of graffiti left by garrison soldiers who stood watch here hundreds of years ago. You cannot read the characters in the dark, but your fingers trace the shapes, and there is something quietly extraordinary about touching a mark left by a human hand so long ago. That soldier watched these same mountains. He felt this same stone under his hand, still warm from the afternoon sun or cold from the night air. He probably thought about home, about food, about whether his replacement would arrive on time. The concerns of daily life do not change much across centuries. Only the walls and the clothing are different. You pass another tower, this one in better condition, its walls still standing to their full height, and the doorway frames a rectangle of stars. The architects who designed these towers understood something about proportion and placement that went beyond military function. They set them at the points where the wall changed direction or crested a ridge, so that each tower commanded the widest possible view of the surrounding landscape. Standing in the doorway of one of these towers at night, the view is so open and so still that the boundary between the land and the sky begins to soften. The mountains become dark shapes without edges, and the stars reflect faintly off the stone, and everything blurs into a single quiet field of blue and black and silver. You walk on, and your footsteps are the only sound. The paving stones are uneven but familiar now, and your body has adjusted to their rhythm, stepping over the raised ones, avoiding the gaps where the mortar has crumbled away. It is the kind of walking that requires no thought, just a steady forward movement that matches the pace of your breathing. The wall rises slightly and then levels out along a broad section of ridge where the walkway widens and the parapets on both sides are low enough to see over without effort. To the north, the grasslands of the steppe stretch out in the darkness, vast and flat and impossibly quiet. To the south, the farmland descends in terraces toward the valley floor, and the faint shapes of trees line the edges of fields that have been cultivated for longer than the wall has stood. You are standing on the line between two worlds, just as this wall has always been a line between two worlds, and in the dark, the distinction feels less like a border and more like a seam. Not a division, but a joining. The place where the steppe and the farmland are stitched together by stone. The tea that went north and the horses that came south. The merchants and the soldiers and the farmers and the nomads, all meeting at this narrow line of rock running across the mountains. The wall was always more connection than separation, even when the people who built it intended the opposite. Your pace slows. The stones are cool and smooth beneath your feet, and the air sits gently against your skin. Ahead, the wall descends into a shallow saddle between two hills, and the path curves so gradually that you feel as if the wall itself is guiding you somewhere specific. There is a wide, flat section of parapet where the stone forms something almost like a bench, and you sit down. The stone holds the last faint trace of warmth from the day's sun, and it supports your weight the way it has supported the weight of everything that has ever passed along this wall. Soldiers and merchants and laborers and emperors and goats carrying bricks and donkeys carrying grain and millions of footsteps over hundreds of years, all held up by this patient, quiet structure. You lean back and look up at the sky, and the stars are so dense and so still that they seem closer than they should be, as if the altitude has brought you nearer to them. The wall stretches away in both directions, east and west, toward oceans you cannot see, and the mountains hold it in place the way cupped hands hold water. Everything is very still now. The wind has stopped entirely, and the silence is the kind that feels less like an absence of sound and more like a presence of something else. The wall does not need you to remember its history tonight. It does not need you to remember anything at all. It has held its own memory for more than 2,000 years, in the layers of rammed earth and the kiln-stamped bricks and the sticky rice mortar that holds tighter than anything modern science has improved upon. It will go on holding that memory long after tonight, long after this walk, long after the stars above you have shifted into a different arrangement. You can let go of all of it now. The facts, the stories, the names and dates and distances. They will be here when you come back. The wall is not going anywhere. Your eyes are heavy and the stone beneath you is steady, and the night is as quiet as a night has ever been. Let the mountains hold the wall. Let the wall hold you, and let the darkness carry you gently into sleep. This has been Kaito. Thank you for sharing the ancient stillness of the wall with me tonight. Let the comforting crackle of the hearth fire carry you gently to sleep. Sleep well. Good night.